So I'm very pleased to introduce our last panel, being moderated by the wonderful Emily Bradley. She's an Associate Director of the Center for Health Law and Policy Innovation, the Director of the Food Law and Policy Clinic, and our Faculty Advisor at the Food Law Society.
All right. Thank you so much, Grant. Thanks, everyone. Just before we start this panel, I want to just take a really quick second to recognize the board members from the Student Harvard Food Law Society who have done an incredible job pulling this together. So I'm just going to say their names and they can come up and we can give them a round of applause at the end. So we have Erin Schwartz, Rachel Clark, Christina Almendarez, Kate Schmidt, Grant Barbosa, and Lauren Seidner, who's not here today. So thank you, guys.
How'd like you get along?
So we're running a little bit late, but hopefully everyone here is as enthralled as I am with this topic, so you won't mind staying a little bit late to hear the rest of the panel. So I'm just going to quickly introduce our esteemed panelists. We have a really great group this morning. So we're going to start with Michael Crupain, who is the Associate Director of Consumer Reports Safety and Sustainability Group and Director of the Food Safety and Sustainability Center there. And he's new to Consumer Reports, but we're really excited to have him here today because he is also a physician trained in preventive medicine. So we have kind of a new voice, a new discipline to add to our group from the past few days. Next to Michael is Christina Roberto, who is a psychologist and epidemiologist. She's now a Robert Wood Johnson Health and Society Scholar at Harvard School of Public Health, and she focuses her research on understanding individual and environmental reasons for people exhibiting unhealthy eating behaviors and looks at things like menu labeling, front of pack labeling, and marketing targeted to children. And then finally, the wonderful Andrew Gunther, who helped make this event possible. He's the program director at Animal Welfare Approved, where he's been since 2008. And prior to that, he was at Whole Foods as the Senior Global Animal Compassionate Product Procurement and Development Specialist. Did I get that all right?
It's Global Animal Compassionate Product Development and Procurement Specialist.
Okay.
I had the longest title in the company. No.
So just to give you sort of an overview of what we're going to talk about, I mentioned earlier, yesterday we really focused on health and nutrition claims, both on Nutrition Facts panel and on the front of packages. And this morning we heard a little bit about methods of production, humane raising, those kinds of issues. So we're trying to, in this panel, pull those things back together a little bit, kind of talk again about some of the claims that companies make that are really not required, but that they're choosing to make on their own, and the effect that that has on consumers, and hopefully get to the point where we're talking a little bit about some solutions and takeaways from this event. So we're going to try to get the panelists there, and hopefully in the Q&A at the end we can sort of have things we can all take home and think about and do after this event. So without further ado, I'll turn over to Michael Crupain to start us off.
On the computer.
Good morning or afternoon. So yesterday I heard from Urvashi talking about labels, and Urvashi is really an expert on labels, and it's going to be hard to add too much new to what she told you, but I'm going to try a little bit. So I'm the director of the Food Safety and Sustainability Center at Consumer Reports, and yesterday also in the panels we talked a little about safety, and so I wanted to start off kind of telling you what we think safety means when it comes to food. So I think a lot of times when people think about food safety, they think about contaminated food, like rotten food, or something in the food that's going to kill you or make you sick sort of right away. But when we think about safety, we take a longer view. So we're concerned about things that are in your food that are going to kill you or make you sick over your lifetime. We did a big story about arsenic in rice back in September, and it wasn't because we think that arsenic is a poison that's going to kill you if you eat rice. It's because arsenic is a poison that's going to increase your risk of a lot of things like cancers and heart disease over a lifetime of exposure. We also think that there's the practices and production elements of where food comes from are part of safety. So the fact that we feed chicken to arsenic to chickens, and that ends up getting back into our food system, into our rice, that's a practice we're concerned about. We're concerned about how our like antibiotic resistance is a big problem we're concerned about. So the fact that we feed animals antibiotics and that creates resistant bacteria that gets back into the human population, we consider that a safety problem. The way we manage manure, the way we treat animals, the way we house animals, we all think that impacts workers, that impacts the environment, that impacts the communities, and that becomes a health and safety issue. So when we talk about safety, we're looking at sort of the big picture of safety. And so I think that kind of feeds into labels too, for what we do, or as a physician, when I think about a food label, whether it's about calories or some ingredients, or it's about production practices, to me, that's about safety and that's about health, because we take this big view of what those things are. So what we do at Consumer Reports is we try to change the way people look at the world they live in. We try to make it a safer place for consumers. We do that by publishing our magazine and educating consumers. We do that through advocacy work, and we do that by sort of, as Urvashi said, watchdogging different standards and labels. And what we have up here is this website. We have Greener Choices, and we think this is one of the sort of solutions we give you to dealing with the label issue. And we think that by people learning more about what labels actually mean, they can make better choices. And so we've come up with a system, or Urvashi came up with a system, a great system of how we evaluate labels. Okay, and we've been talking a lot about how labels should be not deceptive, and they should be truthful. And we really think labels should be meaningful. So one of our primary criteria is that the label is meaningful. And what that means is a couple of things. A meaningful label should be above the baseline that we talked about before. So if everyone is doing, has their broiler chickens in a barn, and you put the label cage-free on there, it's not very meaningful, because that's sort of the standard, okay? We also think that label should, so that should add value. What's the other thing I think? Oh yeah, it should meet the consumer's definition of what it means. So if it's meaningful, it should mean what it's supposed to mean. So something like natural, we talked about yesterday, the USDA defines natural as no artificial ingredients and minimally processed. But when consumers hear the word natural, see the word natural, they think it means something different. So we've done some surveys on that, and like between 65 and 85% of consumers think that the label natural should mean that the animal's diet was free of chemicals, drugs, and animal byproducts, that the animals were in a natural environment, they had access to the outdoors, that they were treated humanely and not confined. So that's what the polling data suggests. A lot more than 20% of people think that that's what it should mean. So if that's not what it means, we don't think it's obviously meaningful. Also, to be meaningful, there probably be some evidence behind that designation. So especially when you're talking about sort of different humane labels, we have the ability, as the last speaker mentioned, to sort of measure welfare of animals, and so that's a science-based process. So we should take that into consideration when we're talking about the meaning of different labels. And then finally, for a label to really be meaningful, it should be verifiable. So there should be someone auditing that, or we should have a way to check on what's going on. So if you go to our website, you can see we'll look at different labels, and we'll classify how meaningful they are for you. We also have the criteria of consistency. So Urvashi talked about yesterday how you might have organic dry cleaning or organic shampoo, and that's not necessarily the same as organic food. So that takes away from the meaning of that label. So we think that we shouldn't be able to do things like that. Also, we have transparency. So you should know what those definitions are for what that label means. So I think, like Animal Welfare Approved, if you go to their website, you can read about all the different qualifications that you need to have to meet their label. So that is good. Also, for transparency, you should know about the company that's creating that label. So we should know about the structure of that company, who's on the board of that organization, where they're getting their money from, and how that might influence who they give their label to or how they give out their label. So do they have any conflicts of interest? That's really important for the label. So we like to talk about that. Also, we think independence is really important. Consumer Reports, we're a nonprofit organization where we really value our independence and integrity, and we sort of would apply that same standard to other people we rate things. That's sort of what we're really known for, rating things. So if you're going to put a label on something and certify something, we would think you should have that same level of independence. Otherwise, again, you have a conflict of interest and it's not as meaningful. And then finally, there should be an opportunity for public comment, or at least comment from the stakeholders who are involved in that process. So for the organic standards, obviously it's a government-run program. Everyone in the public can comment on that, can go to the meetings and have their voices heard. For some other maybe independent labels, it'd be important that they were engaging all the different stakeholders, whether they're farmers, scientists, regulators. Everyone would have an opportunity to comment on what they're doing. So that's how we think labels should be rating. That's what we provide on our website. I think that when you think about labels, when they work, when they're meaningful, they really can have a really important impact. And the last speaker was talking about how, just changing the label, like suing these companies, all you get is the label off. But I think that it can be sometimes more meaningful if you think about like the Prop 65 labels in California. That label has some meaning. Once you put it on there, companies don't really want to have that ingredient that label is talking about in their product, so they're going to get rid of it. Or if you think about calorie labeling laws in like New York City and the restaurants, and it's should be the law across the nation soon. A lot of these restaurants, now that they have to display their calories, they change the ingredients in their foods so that they have less calories. So labels can really change the landscape. And I think the other important thing is that labels don't necessarily need to, there's different ways you can get these great labels. They can be sort of government programs, they can be producers or sort of doing things independently, or they can be these independent organizations that take a stand and set a standard that can raise the bar for everyone. So that's all I want to say.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Michael. So my name's Christina Roberto. I'm really thrilled to be here. It's been a very exciting conference. I am a social scientist, so a psychologist and epidemiologist by training. And I'm just curious, how many social scientists are in the room? Okay, so we've got a few. So it's really exciting to be merging law with social science, and hopefully I'll give you a perspective on consumer surveys and the kind of research that we do to try to tap into this and understand labeling issues. The big point I want to make here is that labels are really powerful, and I'm going to delve into some of the social science work on this. So we've talked a lot about labels that are, really clearly misleading. The space that I'm working in are labels that might actually be, correct, factually truthful, but still are having a really negative impact on people. And by negative impact, I mean, promoting the overconsumption of nutrient-poor, energy-dense foods. So I'm really focused on obesity and food policy. So that's the perspective I take. How are these labels getting people to overconsume foods and then leading to this crisis we have right now? So I'll present just 3 simple studies that I think really illustrate this point. Brian Wansink, for any of you who know his work, is really a leader in this, does a bunch of extremely powerful and clever studies in this area. So what does he do? So he randomized people to one of 2 bowls of M&Ms. One of them is labeled as regular. One of them is labeled as low fat, right? We see this all the time on food products. When there's that regular label on there, people eat about 190 calories worth of the M&Ms. When there's the low-fat label, people eat 244 calories of the M&Ms. It's a significant difference. So this small label is actually impacting consumer behavior, not just perceptions. The organic label, right? This is a big one. So we've got these Oreos made with organic flour and sugar. So even if you just accept that that is factually true, they're made with organic flour and sugar, how does that impact consumers? Well, what we see is that when people are randomized to see one of these 2 packages, they think that the organic Oreos are lower in calories and they can eat them more often. Now, I can tell you right now, and I've done some research on this, packaged foods with the organic label do not differ in their nutrient content. So that's not, it's not an accurate perception. This goes one step further. So then they ask people in the survey, I give them a little vignette about Susie. So you pretend you're a participant right now. Susie is a 20-year-old sorority member with a weight loss goal. Susie typically runs 3 miles after dinner. However, on this day, she was considering foregoing exercise to spend more time on schoolwork. Good job, Susie. Susie ate roasted vegetables over brown rice for dinner. And then participants are randomized to either see that Susie then chose an organic dessert, a non-organic dessert, or no dessert. Okay, so that's the description that you got, one of those three. What does that mean? Well, then when you ask people, under these circumstances, do you think it would be okay for Susie to skip her usual 3-mile run tonight? And they can rate it from not okay to very okay. If she ate an organic dessert, they think it's very okay to skip the exercise later. Significantly more so than if she ate just a plain old regular dessert, right? And it's comparable to if she ate no dessert. Right, so these labels have a very powerful impact on what people think, even regarding, exercise habits, which have no relationship, of course, to the organic claim. Interestingly, when the label makes you think a food is healthy, there's research on this that really points, I think, to the public health problem of all of these health claims that are circulating. So first of all, we know that people perceive healthy foods as low in calories. So in this one study, students get randomized to a healthy chocolate bar, so it's labeled as healthy, and that's a kind of common claim you might see, or a tasty chocolate bar, same exact chocolate bar, right? And then there's a control group, doesn't have any chocolate bar. And then if we ask people, how hungry are you? What you see is that when they've eaten the exact same chocolate bar labeled as healthy, they actually think they're hungrier afterwards than if it's labeled as tasty. So these labels start to really get into the human psychology. It's changing your perceptions of how hungry you are. Okay, so then they take it a step further. Then they randomize students to bread. It's either labeled as healthy or labeled as tasty. And then they go on to, you eat your bread, and then they measure how many pretzels you happen to have at a snack a little bit later. If you've eaten bread labeled as healthy, you eat more pretzels later than if you've eaten bread labeled as tasty. Okay, so these labels get into your perception of hunger, and then that, in turn leads to how much you're actually eating later. So this is a chain that's going, way beyond just the misleading, but really impacting consumer behavior. Really powerful study. It's the last one I'll show here. Participants come into a lab. They're randomized to 2 milkshakes. One is labeled as an indulgent shake. One is labeled as a Sensi shake. Okay, they get consumers rating. They think the Sensi shake is healthier. That's the only difference, same exact milkshake. What I'm gonna show you is some biology here. These are ghrelin levels. So ghrelin is a hunger hormone. It helps regulate hunger and satiety. How do these labels impact our physiological response when we're eating? I'll show you right now. So you see at the top there, that's ghrelin release. When you're drinking the indulgent shake, you're getting hungrier as you drink it, and your ghrelin is appropriately rising. And then it appropriately, comes down. You get less hungry as you drink it over time. Do you see what's happening with the Sensi shake? Your ghrelin response is different simply because you think it's a healthier milkshake. So you're not as satisfied. The response is dull there. It goes up a little and then down a little. That is really powerful from a label. This is why I think we need to care a lot about these labels. So I just want to point out again, I'm interested in this space where, sure, it might be factually correct, 0 grams of trans fat. That might be true, that KFC has 0 grams of trans fat. And it is true that these jujubes are a fat-free food. But I still think it's problematic, and we need to do something about it because of the way it's impacting consumers. And I'll briefly end on the front of packaged food labeling. Doing a lot of work in this area, and I won't have time to get into that research, but I'll just give a few thoughts because it's been a big theme of the conference. So Mike Jacobson showed this industry-initiated label, this facts up front. So, I'm interested in how this marketing affects people in the way I just showed you, but I'm also interested in the best ways to communicate information to the consumer. So from a psychology perspective, here's what I see it's problematic with this. First, you've got a lot of information, and you've got a lot of numbers. You've got percentages, and there's research out there showing that consumers get more confused by percentages in nutrition information. Then you've got this milligrams and grams information, and that, who even knows what that means? Then you've got a monochrome label. And the last concerning piece is you've got companies can cherry pick certain nutrients to feature on here. And that's how you might end up with a Cocoa Krispy cereal that is touting its vitamin A. So, you know, there are a lot of options for front of package food labeling. I think this is a really important area in the policy front. We could go the no label route. We could stick with what the industry's done with facts up front. We could use one of these third-party systems like NuVal we talked about yesterday, which is a single summary score. This is the Institute of Medicine's version, a graded 3-star symbol. We could do a version of the traffic light, or we can do, and that's red, yellow, green for different nutrients in a food product. Or we can do, and this is the one personally that I'm leaning to, just applying kind of psychological principles to what we think might work best, a single traffic light. You know, it's simple, it's clear, it's sort of intuitive, you've got this color scheme, it's rating the whole product, and there's actually some good data coming out now that these kinds of symbols are impacting people's purchasing behavior. And that's really, and from my perspective, the data we need on consumer behavior. Now, the political side of this is, what company would ever want a red traffic light on their food? They don't. But we're moving towards graphic warning labels with tobacco, and obviously that's caught up in a lot of legal battle. But I think we should still try to figure out what's the optimum labeling system and can we get there. And that's why I like chatting with lawyers about this. They sort of tell me that's a good idea, but it's not legally possible, or it is. So I'll put it out there to think about. And so I'll just wrap up by saying another concern with front of package labeling is, let's say we get to the point where we get this great label on the packaging. The reality is there is a lot going on food packaging. You've got these cute, cuddly characters, like we all love them. You've got other claims happening there, heart healthy, whole grain. So by the time you get to a front of package label, I think we've got to figure out which labels are going to capture attention, are going to be able to compete with these other claims on the packaging, and is it even going to be effective? Are consumers even going to notice them? So I'll end on my, preliminary solutions, and we'll obviously talk more. I think that it's really important to have science documenting the effects of these labels and the way that I showed you. How are they impacting consumers everywhere from just perceptions, from perceptions of misleading people to behavior and physiology and biology. I do, I work at the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity, and we do something called strategic science. And that's why I'm so excited to be here, because it's partnering with folks like you, lawyers, policymakers, advocates, so that we're crafting research questions in concert. So when I design a study, my outcome is going to actually make sense for the law. It's going to have legal implications. And I think that's essential. That's why I think it's great what's happening here in terms of interdisciplinary efforts. My recommendations for front of package food labeling, I think we need a uniform label. I think it has to be consistently placed on the product, always in the right-hand corner, for example. It's got to be large enough to grab attention, can't blend in. I'm sorry, I have a cold if you can't tell. Has to be really simple for the consumer to understand. And by that I mean, I'd avoid percentages. I'd try to, keep numbers to a minimum. And if you are going to use numbers, try to accompany it with text like high, medium, low for a traffic light. And in the health claims realm, I would say that, I think it's important that all foods meet a rigorous nutrition standard before a claim can be put on there. So Jen Pomeranz talked about this yesterday with added sugars. I think we need to have some standards so that candy just can't say it's a fat-free food. I think that has the potential to really mislead consumers, even though it's true. And I'll end with that.
The good news is, yet again, I've learned something else, that eating organic food doesn't actually keep you thin. Maybe I do need to exercise, as my wife tells me. I'm Program Director of Animal Welfare Approved, and it's been an absolute honor and humbling to be an event like this. And I'm one of these arrogant folks that thinks I know everything about my subject. In the last 36 hours, I've been proven incredibly wrong. I know so little about the labeling system, and something that I complain about, and the last presentation was absolutely amazing. And please, thank you for being on our side, because I'm sure Coca-Cola employs hundreds of folks as bright as you to convince us to drink their garbage. Just to sort of put it into context, and the good news with me is on my restroom wall I have letters of cease and desist from Tyson, and it says, or was going to say, in case of emergency, break glass. I write in Huffington Post, and I'm really not, don't pull back on what I say. But AWA is working, across the US, Canada, this thing's sort of slightly, and we're just about to go into Europe with all of these various brands. And they just sort of contextualize the sort of organization we are. The one thing I got from the past few days is that consumers are confused. I think that's deliberate, bluntly. I'm not going to mince my words. I think the companies sit down with incredibly bright people and figure out how to deceive us. That's what they do. As a Brit, I believe we can legislate our way out of it. As a sort of naturalized American, I think I'm going to the free market Glock system, where let's get ahead of the curve. And I just wanted to revisit a couple of things. It's quite true. I came here via Texas. I bought a tank full of fuel, and they gave me an Armalite. It was amazing. You know, buy one, get one free on a Friday. It was a whole new meaning to a magazine of 6mm rounds. How many people in the room would say this was a confinement feeding operation? Show of hands. Do we think this is confinement dairy? Okay, so how many people in the room would consider this to be a pasture-based dairy? No, no. So how many, Melissa, how many people in the room would consider, you've seen this slide, how many people in this room would consider it to be a certified organic dairy? There you go, get your hands up. This is a certified organic dairy. Just be careful when you look at labels, and Avashi covered this, and Michael covered this. There is some really deceptive labeling. The consumer perception with organic is it's a bucolic cow on pasture. This is a picture of an organic dairy. So these are some great, so I can see them here. These are some great, thank you, Michael. What it doesn't mean, organic does not mean pasture raised. It doesn't mean responsible use of antibiotics. It means a prohibition, a total prohibition of antibiotics, causing a two-tier food system. What it doesn't mean is high animal welfare standards. In fact, there are no animal welfare standards of significance in organic regulations. It certainly doesn't mean environmentally responsible because they allow liquid manure systems. And it certainly doesn't mean that the food is necessarily healthier. In some cases, it can be nutritionally deficient. And I'm not trying to put you off, and it certainly doesn't mean family farmed. What it does mean is all animals must be fed organic feed. Animals treated with antibiotics must be segregated and removed from the system. The problem with antibiotic use is not the antibiotic. It is the bacteria that becomes resistant to the antibiotic. So if you're still treating an animal with an antibiotic, you're still potentially causing the resistance. Removing it from the feed chain is just not achieving very much at all. We need a systemic change where we stop the animals becoming sick. And then we've got this crazy thing, which is a range of organic labels, and Avashi and Michael can speak to this better than me, but it's a percentage of organic. It's like an animal spending two-thirds of its life on pasture, which is a claim that's regularly made. That means it spent 1/3 of its life on a feedlot. Well, that's what the industry does anyway. So it's another way of saying this is a conventional cow fed on a feedlot, but it just sounds so much better. Natural, this is my favorite claim of all. It doesn't mean pasture raised, it doesn't mean antibiotic controls, it doesn't mean environmentally sound. And as Michael said, steal my thunder, it means minimally processed, no artificial ingredients. So you buy something with natural on its label, all it means is the meat itself was minimally processed. It's not tested for the absence of or presence of anything. In fact, it's not tested at all because it's an affidavit-made claim where the person getting profit from making the claim is actually responsible for saying it is. We stopped buying product from snake oil salesmen, some of us did, at the turn of the century. We wanted some evidence. We've heard a lot about it, and you know, Consumer Reports just lead the way in this subject. Verified and unverified claims. If somebody says something on a product, we advocate for that claim to be inspected or verified. Other than that, it is worthless. And you go to things like AHA and UEP, which is American Humane Certified, and the United Egg Producers, they inspect a percentage of their farms, and the rest of their production system is certified on that inspection. So they're seeing 3% or 5% of the total farms producing. So when you've got, you know, a certified organic farmer who has to have every farm inspected, it may be $1,200, $1,300 a go. other people are being able to make claims for nothing. So independently verified is something we strongly advocate for. Get a third party, independent third party. Consumer Reports, you can look at the labels and they report on whether it's third party or not. This is something I had done for me, food labeling for dummies. My wife and my children just completely agree with it, was done for me. What we did is we took the claims made on meat across America and we tried to write what each one meant. And we really, really struggled because it's really impossible to find out what each claim really means, because it's by affidavit and it means different things to different people. So we wrote this in the negative of the positive. We actually say what it doesn't mean. So if you go through it, we'll say that there are many claims in there that talk about fair trade, and yes, the check mark, I nearly said tick, the check mark is in fact it's been audited. So you can see if the claim's been audited by a verified third party. And the question mark says it hasn't. And you can see on the naturally raised where it has no other issues. And if you're interested in animal welfare, there are only 2 seals in the United States that certify and inspect slaughter. One is animal welfare approved and the other one is certified humane. So only 2 of us go and look at the slaughter plant. Organic inspection does not look at the method of slaughter. A little bit about us. We believe we sit at the confluence of environmentally sound, socially responsible, and high welfare farming. Because our standards do not allow the farmer to pollute the planet. They don't allow the company to, in my mind, make indentured servants of really great people. I'm from a farmer, I am a farmer, and I believe my equivalence to a doctor and a lawyer is written. We are custodians of the countryside. What farmers do changes the countryside. The problem with society is we have pushed farmers lower down the respect chain. And we have to bring farmers back up because they are stewards of the countryside. And I am a walking example of how not to eat. I eat great food. I have great farmers who supply great chefs who take a great deal of pride. I get one of everything on the menu and I have no self-will. They bring it out, I eat it, and it's kind of what it is. And I was brought up, my grandmother was Victorian, and she said, clean your plate. And to this date, I will never leave a piece of food on the plate. My wife feeds me a piece of toast. That's how I stop eating quite as much. And I just wanted to end with this picture and explain a little bit. The food makes us what we are, and the ingredients of our food make us what we are. And somehow we have to find a labeling program and a series of labels that help us reconnect with that food. Because, and I'm a great lover of First Nation Americans, when all our rivers have been fished dry, when all of our forests have been chopped down, when all of our air is unbreathable, only then will we understand that we cannot eat money.
So I'm just going to start it off with a question and then get ready with your questions. And who has the microphones? Aaron, somebody? Okay, we have microphones that will go around for you. So I think one thing that really the past 2 days of this panel really brought to the forefront to me is that there's sort of these different series of claims, and we talked a little more about this yesterday, but maybe to bring this back in, that they're controlled by different agencies. So I'm wondering for our panelists, you know, and I think Christina sort of started talking about this a little bit, claims that might be about production, but that people think are a health claim, and, you know, the proliferation of all these claims on packages. Do you think that there's some way to sort of streamline all of this together? Maybe the fact, you know, what do you think can be done really on a big picture to make sure that the way that all these different claims are interacting with one another in a way that is sensible and meaningful to consumers?
I mean, I think one thing we need to do is we need to apply the same standards to all the different claims. And as Urvashi pointed out the other day in her keynote, we have maybe three different agencies regulating claims, and they're applying their rules in a different way. And I like to think that they're kind of cheating. When you look at FDA defines natural one way, USDA defines it another way, FTC says you shouldn't be deceptive, but they're kind of getting away with being deceptive by just defining things in a different way. So I think we need to define things in a meaningful way, the way they're meant to be defined, and we need to just apply the same rules of enforcement across the board.
Well said. Yeah, no, I mean, and my area of expertise is not in, the law and the legal regulation of it all, but I agree, like, if there's a simple way, so I throw out there, if you could have one sort of standard rigorous nutrition criteria that all foods got evaluated by, and it really had to meet a certain threshold before it could have any kind of claim at all on it, so fruits and vegetables could have really great claims on them. That might be one way to go, but I realize that would be extraordinarily difficult to achieve. But I always shoot for the ideal.
I think anywhere where you've got 3 or 4 agencies competing, you're going to get confusion. And I think in our system where pressure can be brought about, the one that springs to mind was in vitro use of antibiotics in chicken eggs. Before the chick got to its 18th day, so before it was breathing, allowed a poultry company to make the claim that the chicken was in fact antibiotic free or raised without antibiotics. So I think we need some correlation of the agencies and some very clear rules about what a word means, and we believe that there's a huge great definitions document on our website, and I know Avash and her team really do try and define, but get these agencies to work together under one boss without political influence or corporate influence or social influence.
Questions from the audience?
My name is Diana. I'm a small vegetable farmer from Rhode Island. I have a question from the other side. Currently, I'm a certified, well, quote-unquote, USDA certified organic farmer. I used to be certified by the state of Rhode Island before the U.S. government took over the word organic, and the state of Rhode Island had standards that were meaningful, that took into account your care for the land and all kinds of things that the current standards don't address at all. So I'm small. I sell directly to my consumers. They know me. I can tell them what I really have. But if you're bigger, what do you do? I mean, there's all these different labels I could go to, and what I've seen with the organic label is that when the government took it over and when it became bigger versus smaller, it had less meaning.
I come from Europe. We kind of started the organic thing, and it still exists. We have big organic, which is the EU regulation, and then you have things like the Soil Association who have a different standard. And I think the moment you get corporate interest involved, you get dilution. And I think every speaker spoke to that, but there has to be accessibility. I think it's really unfair that you farm to a higher standard and have to sell in the same marketplace, but I think that's part of this conversation. We need to have a baseline and an ability for you to step beyond that baseline and make yourself different.
Yeah, I think we saw today an example of a company that's using multiple labels to sort of enhance what their brand and what they're telling people they do. I think that's probably a good opportunity. And in Consumer Reports, we spend a lot of time, we think organic's a good label, but there's plenty of room for improvement, so we spend a lot of time trying to raise that standard and make sure that it is more meaningful, and everyone is invited to participate in that process.
Hi, my name is Emma. I'm a student at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. And I'm wondering if you're optimistic about the piecemeal way that we're going about changing food labels in the US, or if you think there's really a need for some kind of overhaul.
Well, I'm an optimist by nature. So I mean, I think there's value, and Mike Jacobson and folks were talking yesterday that you really need to, you'll almost get overwhelmed if you don't tackle some of these issues sort of one by one and one label at a time. But I do think, there's reason to hope that there might be some big overarching goals. So front of package labeling might be one of those. And I know it's kind of up in the air what's going to happen with that. But if we got to a point where there was this, concerted effort to really try to come up with a clear, consistent label, based on strong nutrition criteria that was on all food products. That'd be a huge step. It'd be on thousands and thousands of foods. If there was good science to back up what we were doing, I think that has a lot of potential both to influence a consumer and also encourage product reformulation.
Hi, I have a question here. Adam Solomon from Ag and Food Law LLM in Arkansas. I just wonder if you look at any studies or basically your opinion on whether our focus should be on the harm or the health claim, the positive or the negative. The only thing that seems to so far to represent harm is the calories count, but everything else is a positive. It's vitamin A, it's this and that, and of course the sugar is left out. And if we're going to proceed that way and regulate what goes on, it seems that we're only regulating the positives and not focusing on the harm. Should our focus be on the harm, or to what extent should it go there? Thanks.
Can I have a first stab at that? You see, you make a really interesting point, because we actually have a relatively unregulated market. We can use arsenicals anytime we like. We can basically go to a store and buy a 50-pound bag of tetracycline and chuck it into our pig food. So I think as long as we don't have any laws protecting the baseline, I think labeling has to address the negative. I think if you can get some regulation that takes away some of the negative risk. Who would have thought you'd have an arsenic in chicken? How does that get there? It's a known carcinogenic. That's insane. But we don't have a regulation that stops it yet. Aversi's working on it. So that would be my 2 cents. I think you have to promote the positive and also, assert that the negative doesn't exist.
So this is a really interesting question, and it comes up a lot, at least from the obesity perspective, right? Because companies could, use their power, so to speak, to promote healthy foods. And some say, we should be doing both. We should be promoting healthy foods and trying to restrict the unhealthy foods. I really think that just promoting healthy foods and just highlighting that, there might be better calories and good calories, but it's possible that we're just putting kind of more calories into the system and it wouldn't address obesity. I really think you need to pull back on, food marketing of unhealthy foods, claims that are touting the health of unhealthy foods. If that doesn't happen, I don't think just the positive promotion is going to get us to where we need to be. And that's why I like something like a traffic light label that isn't just saying, hey, this food's really good for you. It's also saying, and these are not so good for you.
Those lines, because I found your work fascinating, and the fact that someone would see organic and think it was healthier and eat more of it or feel hungrier or whatever it is, how do you get away from that? Even with a single circle of calorie count, it seems to me from what you're saying, people make an inherent assumption about that claim and then alter their behavior. So unless they've got some comparisons they're doing among the same product without the claims, really looking at what you're looking at in the studies, how are they going to be able to make different decisions just based on that circle? It seems to me we're still in a knot on that, and I'm curious about your thoughts on how we educate people to stop thinking that low fat is, to stop getting at the problems that you identified.
Right, yeah, that's a great question. So I should say that much of the research I presented is done by colleagues of mine, so it's not just my own work. I make sure I acknowledge that. So for example, one question that I'm curious in is what I was saying, if we get a really good front of package label, but there's so much other stuff happening on the package, does that really get us anywhere? And some people have written about this. David Ludwig, Mary Nessel have said, we just shouldn't have any labels. And maybe, it's open to debate, but there might be some value or merit to that maybe product, Oreos should probably not have any label on it that suggests anything positive about it. So that's one approach. I do really like.
That's something else in the process of doing that.
Right. Well, so, so I think it is an open question. I personally do think there's values to labels, and I'm very practical. So I think we're probably not going to get to a point, at least in the immediate future, where we're going to take all these labels away. So I do think there's room, especially if you've got, so I'll step back for a minute. Consumers really want trusted, credible information. So if you had something coming from the government that people really felt like, like a front of package label that they could trust, that might help negate some of the company claims. Because there is a decent amount of consumer skepticism about a lot of those claims. The problem is they still subtly influence us.
I think Christina's presentation showed us an interesting thing about perception. And what she was really showing us was that people aren't making decisions to eat more. People are subconsciously making those decisions to eat more based on what that label means to them. They're not deciding I'm going to eat extra Oreos. They just do. And so, understanding more about how that happens is probably the next step, and then changing the environment in which we live so that you wouldn't be prone to do that just maybe from the packaging or what the actual food is would be helpful.
Just one quick comment about the overhaul issue, because I hear this a lot. I think it's important to remember that the actual agencies don't assume authority or power.
Just for those that aren't here, Michael, it might be worth letting folks know who you are.
I was a speaker yesterday. I'm from UCLA Law School, and
a leading light on labeling, I believe.
Teach food law and policy. But I think that it's important to recognize that the agencies themselves, the FTC, the FDA, and the Department of Agriculture, don't assume authority over these labels. It's granted to them by statute. And so in order to have an overhaul, it's going to take an act of Congress. And what's interesting is you take the USDA, for example, which has jurisdiction over the labeling of meat. Well, the USDA also is empowered to promote meat. And so there is this interesting problem where you have an agency that's in charge of promoting meat at the same time regulating the dissemination of information about meat product and the raising of animals and so forth. The FDA, who has jurisdiction over the balance of the food supply, has very little knowledge of what goes on the farm. And really don't have a perspective at all in terms of food values, connecting with food. And the FTC, which is responsible for the advertising of food, knows even less about food than the FDA or the USDA combined. And so it's a really interesting, odd way of regulating food labeling. But I thought it'd be at least useful to point that out, that this is all set up because of statute and the variety of different statutes that have been passed. Many of them were passed years ago before we even contemplated a lot of the issues that we face today. But along those lines, one of the interesting thoughts that I've had sitting here and thinking about this for some time now is that a couple years ago, the Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees the FDA, and the USDA issued a dietary guideline report in which they said we should eat less processed food and more fruits and vegetables. And yet 99% of our focus in terms of labeling is on processed food. It's almost as though we're trying to differentiate the bad from the bad. and I guess the question I would have primarily for you, Christina, is there a way to use this label as a way to orient people away from the middle of the grocery store into the produce department? And so we're eating less processed food, and we're not trying to distinguish between one product that's bad for you with another product that's almost as bad for you in the middle of the grocery store. Should there be different standards? And should the FTC be part of this engineering of different standards in terms of making claims? Because it seems to me that really should be where our focus is.
Yeah, so I mean, I think about this all the time, right? So with front of package labeling, you might be looking at two soups that, you know, are high in sodium and one is slightly less high in sodium. And so I do think that front of package labels tend to shift people within the same aisle. And then how much have we really gained? I don't think people see the label and run out over to the produce section, you know, grab a bunch of oranges. So maybe we could get really terrible graphic warning labels or something. So no, I mean, I think there's definitely room for labeling and marketing, really. So have you all seen the baby carrots, eat them like junk food campaign? Right, so a bunch of baby carrot farmers got together and were selling baby carrots in these bags. And, you know, I love it. I mean, some people will say we really shouldn't do that marketing for any foods, even health foods. I'm a practical person right now. We have this massive obesity epidemic. We've got to do something. So maybe it's not labels, but I think marketing strategies could be really effective to get people to the other aisles. I mean, supermarkets, food companies, they're phenomenal at this. If they all really wanted to promote those foods, you could do placement, you could do different kinds of marketing. I have some research showing that licensed characters like Dora the Explorer or SpongeBob, when they're on foods, kids actually think the food tastes better. So, you know, you don't see those on the carrots and the fruits quite as much. So I don't know if labeling as much as restricting marketing and using other kinds of marketing could achieve that sort of leave this aisle, go to another one.
Hi. I'm from Babson College, Rachel Greenberger. I run a startup for food entrepreneurs, supporting folks who are trying to create new market options. So I come at this from the business side of the house, and I think one of the things that I'm gnawing on and would love to hear your perspectives on, food is a non-negotiable. So as a consumer, you can't not buy food from someone in some form unless you're truly, truly off the grid. But when we're looking at segmentation of the marketplace and the fact that, you know, in terms of the labels that are out there, the one that is the most segmented for me is an animal welfare approved or a certified humane, because there's a value set as well. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, how do we intelligently label to honor the fact that we don't have one solution label for every single human being on the planet? And is there room in the confusion and chaos of labeling for different labels to speak to different values, different food values?
I'll take the first stab. We go back to education. I think if you educate the consumer and the label becomes transparent, then privately run label works. I think the challenge is we lack transparency and we lack honesty, therefore most labels are misleading. If you look at AHA, they allow caged hens, and yet they use the word humane, American Humane Association. How many people in here think putting a chicken in a cage is humane? And no disrespect for the egg farmers that have changed, but raise your hand. I mean, there's not a single hand going up, yet AHA say that's humane. So Michael and I had a quick conversation. It's whether you make it transparent, define the words. I mean, humane is a very ethical, moral kind of situation. Why not use the word welfare, which is scientifically measurable? You can quantify the welfare of an animal. You know, some people do it to add value, and I think that's great. But I think we have to have transparency, then we have great labeling. Until we have transparency, we're wasting our breath.
I come from a graphic design background, and graphic design is a very research and based business. And I guess my question is, where do you think the responsibility lies for people in the package design community to impact packaging?
Yeah, we should talk after, because I actually, in my lab, have several graphic design. I mean, I look to find people who do graphic design work, right? Because I don't have the experience to know the optimum way to design something to, you know, catch the consumer's attention. I think marketing folks are really good at that. So anyone who has that skill set who wants to come on over to this side is really valued. You would know a lot more about the design principles to capture attention, engage the consumer, convey something simply. Yeah, so let's chat.
Hi. My name is Daisy Freund. I'm on the farm animal welfare team at the ASPCA, and thank you for everything that you've been talking about. So a couple of questions just brought me back to this idea of processed and the lack of labels on some of the most healthy foods, especially when we're talking about or healthy, maybe high quality, ethical food, especially talking about small farmers who are often, you know, just they can't afford it. They're selling directly to their consumers. So, and I'm thinking about, I wasn't here for the first part of yesterday, so I don't know if you talked about it, but the Whole Foods decision to label GM foods by 2018 or something. So what role do supermarkets play in all of this, in driving people to the other aisles? I mean, they seem to be the missing link that, especially as more supermarkets come out with, super consumers come out with generics, generic versions of all of these foods, they seem to be a space for labeling. They could have their own labeling, and you know, decisions like the ones that Whole Foods are making with their GAP labels on animal welfare and their GM decisions. It just seems that things are going in that direction, and how do you feel about it? Do you think that they have the ethics behind them to look out for us, or, yeah?
I think what any company does is absolutely incredible. They're going to do it for their shareholders because that's why they're born. And I think if you take a letter from mum as affirmation that something's going on, it's quite unlikely to be the case. I mean, we heard Coca-Cola talk yesterday, and they continue to tell us their products were safe, but they continue to fight for just having one label. I think when the person profiting from the marketing claim is holding the marketing claim up, a consumer needs to be really cynical, unless there's an awful lot of them.
Hi, my name is, sorry. No. My name is Julie Morneau again. As an entrepreneur, my particular area of interest is the cottage industry. And food labeling laws in particular have, I think it's probably the one area where we end up having the most contact with federal regulation. One of the things that I noticed recently, I took a trip out to California, and when I was at the airport, I stopped and I picked up a cookie. And I looked at it real quick. It had the name of the cookie. It had base information on what was in the cookie, but it didn't have any of the allergy warnings on it. It didn't have where it was manufactured or the distributor name. The clerk at the counter had no idea whether or not there were any allergies in there, even though it said walnuts on there. What impact, or what can be done to ensure that what the smallest producers have to stick to is also adhered to by the largest or even the middle manufacturers that package for bulk sale to restaurants and vending sites and 7-Eleven, but they don't necessarily mark their individual packages at the level that they're supposed to be for the individual state requirements?
In meat, it's designed to achieve just that. The smaller producer that sells direct has a lighter touch than the larger producer that sells across the nation. But I think what you've very well put is the challenge that you've got as a smaller producer is to comply with some of the bigger regulations which kind of feel unfair for some of the big farmers. But I don't think much is being done to, we've heard it how many times, to actually enforce our regulations. A lot of really good regulations exist in America, but we don't enforce them. You mentioned one about your omega-3 testing. I'm well aware that the required test for making an omega-3 claim on an egg is you take an egg before you fed omega-3 to the chickens and you test it. And then you take an egg after you've fed omega-3 and you test it and you measure the difference. That's actually a regulation. That's not a theoretical, hypothetical. But it's not being enforced. And one wonders if we enforced 80% of our regulations on a consistent basis, we'd be in a better space. But I think we need everybody. We need the smaller farmer, the larger farmer, the smaller retailer, the larger retailer, the farmer's market. We need a complete toolbox to feed the world.
If I can, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think we need to apply the same safety standards to everyone, but the way we implement them is going to be different. So a small farm is going to have a different way of doing it than a large farm, but I think we always have to think about, even if it's coming from a small farm, it still needs to be safe. And I always think about in Brooklyn, there's like this great food culture, and everyone's making all these jams and jellies and all these things at home, and then they're selling them at a flea market, and I'm thinking, well, where do they make those? And did they apply any of the same safety rules that somebody else would have to? And they probably didn't. And so we have to come up with a way. I don't know the answer, but there needs to be a way to apply safety across the board, but making sure that it doesn't hamper the ability of the small farm or small business to do business.
We would completely agree. Just because you're small doesn't make you safe. In fact, small can make you uneducated and dangerous.
If you don't mind, can I just comment on the question that was asked about Whole Foods labeling announcement? I think it's really dramatic, and it's profound. As I mentioned yesterday in my comments, there's been a power shift in food from manufacturers who have long controlled shelf space to retailers who now have as their primary audience consumers. And it's really quite remarkable. We now have fewer retailers competing. That's the bad side. The good side is that they're now competing not necessarily on price, but on value. And so Whole Foods, I agree with you, Andrew, they only care about their bottom line. That's the way that the corporations work. But the bottom line is that they need to sell to consumers. And the interesting thing is there's been millions of dollars spent in this country over the issue of genetically modified food labeling. California, $40 million was spent to defeat the ballot initiative, $4 million in support, quite a differential. I can't tell you how much money's been spent in Washington, D.C. on lobbying. And here's Whole Foods, out of the blue, with giving 2 cents about the science, regardless of where you think the science falls out, and says we're going to require mandatory labeling. That's dramatic. And it segues into an interesting point about another social phenomena that I think affects all of this, and that's the social media. With pink slime and with other ways of consumers have to communicate with one another, I think social media has a really interesting play in this in terms of affecting labeling and the communication of information to consumers. But we live in an interesting time where consumers from the small farm, when it comes to eggs and poultry and meat, to a larger, more macro level when it comes to these large retailers, it's very interesting. But I wouldn't undersell the power of consumers to affect change through social media and just in making decisions at the store. But you have to have options. And the retailers, I think, are going to create those options much more quickly than the government.
I think my point was just what Whole Foods has done is game-changing, without a doubt. Saying we don't want GM product in our supply chain is going to bring a whole new ability for advocates to make the point that there is a need for change. I think my broader point is, and Whole Foods are somewhat unique, in so much as they say they do what they're going to do. Others may not, and I think we need to be very sensitive in leaving the control of our food supply chain to retailers. But there is no two ways. We all need to stand up and applaud, because it's going to help us with GM salmon. It's going to help us with all sorts of things that a retailer is responding to its customers and making a decision of such gravitas. But I'm cognizant that we've got into this mess by leaving labeling to people who made money from it, and organize a so-called animal welfare claim where they don't have slaughter standards. To me, isn't a welfare claim. I'm really going to get into a conversation about it's a birth to death. That's where the welfare issues. And I wanted to say one thing. Adele says it's one horrible day in an animal's life. If you do it right, it's about 0.003 of a second, on the basis that the animal dies, and in theory it shouldn't know that it's going to die or it is dead. And the science tells us you can do that to a remarkably finite piece. So it just becomes a moral issue whether you want to eat meat or not. That's just our position. But congratulations to Whole Food. I mean, amazing.
I just wanted to add that I think an enlightened corporation realizes that the health and safety of their customers, their workers, and their communities really helps their bottom line. And so I think there is room for that. And I think when we do stories at Consumer Reports, we try to highlight some enlightened companies that do think that way.
I just wanted to mention one thing, and I'm thinking about it sitting here for 2 days because I find it enlightening too, but social media does provide a really interesting way for us to become enforcers and policers of the marketplace. And one thing we've been chucking around, and I think, you know, legal societies, the Harvard Food Law Society could think about it, is setting up a database so that when you're at the airport looking at that cookie and it's not giving you the information it's legally responsible to do. I mean, it's a cookie, right? But in a way, it's still a problem. And to the degree we can cull these problems in the marketplace and centralize them and send a picture from your smartphone into a database with where you saw it, what the manufacturers, what the date was, that becomes the basis of Better Business Bureau complaints, of FTC complaints, and to the degree a legal society or Consumer Reports can start to cull those, I think we can actually do some pretty interesting mass work together to try to leverage that to get the government to get rid of this noise in the marketplace so that these truly competitive labels can actually rise to the top and people can make informed decisions from those. So just a thought and a brainstorm on that.
It's a genius if you could link the picture to an app that would create the BBB complaint. Wouldn't that be funky? Saw this cookie, Better Business, like, it's like dealing with a bank. I mean, you just press a few buttons and it happens.
Clump those into mass problems and then list all the manufacturers. That will elevate the weight problem for the BBB instead of making it one by one by one. That would be the end.
All right,
One by one gives them work to do and keeps them busy forever.
Just to wrap up, I want to give the panelists, I know we have more questions, so hopefully people will stick around and you can kind of ask your individual questions. I wanted to give the panelists a chance just to give any closing remarks, anything, you know, being the last panel of the event. What, as consumers, as everyone in this room are, what do you think everyone should take away from this, or what sort of one final message you want people to take home from this event?
Harvard Food Law rocks. You've got so much information to work with. Go home, look at the websites. Consumer Reports are a great resource, but don't take anything you see on a label as honest or truthful. Check it out yourself.
I guess my perspective as a scientist is I think this is a great forum for us to all make connections. So people working in the sciences, people doing the advocacy work, you know, lawyers, you know, let's all connect around this and be helping each other think about, all right, what about this scientific question? You know, what am I doing on this front? Legally, can we do that? I think this is a great jumping off point for us to connect and work together to think about how to further these goals.
Yeah, I think this was a great event, and I was going to say both of those things.
We just keep stealing your thunder, brother.
So, I mean, I think you really should understand more about the food system and what all these different labels mean. Spend some time looking at that, read Consumer Reports to get more information. Yeah, I think this was a great opportunity to sort of hear different people's opinions from all these different places, and we should keep talking and try to work together on some of these issues.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, let's give a round of applause for the panel. And a final round of applause for the Food Law Society and all of the sponsors and everyone that put this wonderful event together as well.
Emily, can we, just to close, can everybody from the Food Law Society stand up? Would you? And then everybody from AWA's team stand up. And just at the end of a conference, stand up, guys. These are the guys that have worked really, really hard, the AV folks, to make the conference a success. And from the speakers, and I think I speak for all of us, you guys have made this a really easy event. Paul, your transport plan, and I know you had gray hairs over it, you're using this, has worked perfectly. Emily, thank you so much. So all of you from the speakers and panelists, thank you so much, Emily.